Joining us now, Pete Sepp. Pete is the Chief Operating Officer with the National Taxpayers Union, NTU. Pete, good to have you back, man.
Hey, great to be here.
Pete, we got another bailout coming up. This government of ours, it just loves bailing people out. You make bad decisions, you go broke. Who gets bailed out? The banks, the big money people, the government officials. Now we're going to bail out a country. Who bails out the middle class that's getting screwed every day? Anybody?
Well, unfortunately not. We're the ones who get the bill, and unless Congress is very careful here in passing legislation that's going to encourage reform in Puerto Rico, there will be a complete collapse of that island's economy, and U.S. taxpayers in Puerto Rico, as well as on the mainland, are going to be on the hook for it. That's a real threat, and all of this is coming to a head in the House of Representatives in the next few days. It could come down to a handful of votes as to whether a legislative package that's been developed with a few good elements and several really bad ones has to come to a vote. We don't want that to pass in its current form. There's still time to work through some of the details and get this right so that we don't have a collapse in Puerto Rico that precipitates a bailout.
Pete, why don't you define for our audience what exactly happened in Puerto Rico? Why is it in such bad shape? And how much money are we talking about?
Well, there are a lot of problems. Puerto Rico, of course, as a commonwealth, a territory of the United States, was sort of in a limbo in that there were a lot of U.S. federal regulations and laws that were preventing good things like privatizing assets. Puerto Rico itself made a lot of bad decisions in terms of government ownership of things like utility companies. There was also a great deal of corruption on the island among public officials. Huge retirement plans for government employees that are simply unsustainable, that have racked up billions in debts, and problematic tax systems. All of that has combined with an absolutely insatiable appetite for borrowing that has now put Puerto Rico in a very serious situation. We're talking about, as a percent of the annual economy in Puerto Rico, about a 75% debt load. Now, that is debt that the Commonwealth, its municipalities, and its public corporations have taken on. 75% of gross island product is now the equivalent debt level. If you take United States entities like state-level debt and even local debt, no other state comes close to that. New York probably has the worst level of debt as a percentage of its economy, and that's only 25%. So Puerto Rico is in a state about 3 times worse relative to its economy than any U.S. state. That cannot be sustained. There has to be a fundamental fiscal reform of all the practices on the island. And legislation that's been introduced in the House Natural Resources Committee, it's really just a draft right now, would do a control board of sorts, something that would have constant supervision of the island's finances, demand that we get to the bottom of all the financial statements, work on reducing spending, restructuring the pension system. It's similar to what was proposed and enacted for the District of Columbia in the mid-1990s when D.C. got into trouble. The problem is the legislation also contains what amounts to forcing creditors to the table to take huge haircuts on the bonds that they have issued to Puerto Rico's government entities. We have to have a situation where both parties, the creditors and the debtors, come to the table voluntarily and negotiate as equals. Otherwise, if we do away with rule of law here, what's going to happen is Puerto Rico will never get credit again, and we will have a collapse of the island's finances. Who gets left holding the bag for that? We do, as taxpayers.
Quick question, and try to be succinct here. How did Puerto Rico get in this mess?
Fiscal irresponsibility, overborrowing, overtaxing, and overspending.
So what you don't like about the bill that's in Congress now is what? Give me the elements of it that you really don't like.
Elements of the bill that force creditors to come to the table and give Puerto Rico sweetheart deals on bonds that Puerto Rico legitimately owes. That would be a big mistake. It would send a lousy signal to the financial world. It would also allow Puerto Rico to basically be rewarded for its fiscal irresponsibility.
So basically, they screw up, and this would mandate that creditors that issued them bonds, issued them loans, would take a fraction of their worth in return. So basically, those that loaned them the money would lose the money, and Puerto Rico would be absolved of the debt.
Yeah, there is a process in the bill. They call it sort of a backup process. They won't call it Chapter 9 bankruptcy, the thing that U.S. municipalities normally have available to them, but it is what many are calling a forced restructuring process. And, of course, there are many members of Congress who are undecided about this bill. Virginia's own Congressman Whitman is one of them. And really, this is the point in time where members of Congress have to say, no, time is very short, but there is still time for common sense. We need to explore other options here that will equalize the positions of creditors and debtors so they both come to the table and they both work this out voluntarily. That is the best possible outcome for taxpayers in the long run.
Okay, but those that are pushing for the legislation quickly are saying that, look, there's simply not time to negotiate all this stuff, and either we just mandate that creditors take lower payments, or we just, wire them the money and bail them out, because they're saying there just isn't enough time. Maybe they've wasted time, but how do you respond to that?
Yeah, this is really a matter of a few days. We, for example, have proposals on the table that would reform part of the U.S. government's tax treatment of transactions with Puerto Rico. Those have already been developed. They just need to be added to the bill. We can release the restrictions on commerce back and forth between Puerto Rico and the mainland United States, called the Jones Act. It raises the price of goods and services coming on and off the island. We can do something that would allow employers to pay a little less than the minimum wage to employees in Puerto Rico and incentivize job creation. We can also work on these restructuring provisions. It won't be a protracted process if members of Congress are willing to say, we want to do this right, not just quickly.
All right. Sounds like we got to call up Congressman Whitman and tell him no bailout on Puerto Rico. Let's get this thing right. Hey, Pete, National Taxpayers Union, thanks for being with us.
My pleasure. Take care.
All right.